Hello and welcome to the first speaker session in the Law, Environment and Religion class at Yale University. My name is Hannah Malcolm and this is Rebecca Loomis, and we're delighted to be joined this afternoon by James Anaya, Professor of Human Rights and Foreign Policy at the University of Arizona College of Law and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Dr. Anaya, you've worked with people groups all over the world in all sorts of environments. So it seems that the identification of indigenous is very complex in terms of how you come about defining it. What do you think are the key factors in your work that have identified these diverse groups as indigenous?
Well, it's really not so much my work as the work of groups themselves identifying as indigenous over a period of time and asserting claims linked to that identification as indigenous before various forums, and in particular at the global level, United Nations forums. What I did as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was try to identify the particular problems that are common to groups identifying as indigenous and address those under the relevant international standards that have been developing over the last 20 or so years and that are now expressed most prominently in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. It does not include a definition that identifies which groups are indigenous, but it is clear from the instrument itself, from the declaration, that it's talking about groups with certain histories of colonization or something like colonization that are at the margins of society, assert identities that are distinct from the populations that have grown up around them and that want to transmit those identities to future generations. And typically these groups are linked to a particular land base that they wish to continue to be linked to.
So have any of those cases of self-identification as indigenous been particularly controversial or come under question or been the source of issues when dealing with a particular case?
Yes, but mostly in the African and Asian regions, okay, where we see governments contesting that categorization as applicable to particular groups there. Within the American region, meaning North, Central, South America, it's readily accepted, the terminology of indigenous peoples. It's readily accepted that there are groups that were, whose ancestry predates, in the region, predates that of the settler populations, and that maintain identities linked to those pre-settler groups within the region. But when we go outside of the American region, into Africa in particular, you see governments saying things like, well, all the people here are Africa, or everybody, or excuse me, are indigenous. All Africans are indigenous, except those few, relatively few, settlers who remain after the colonial period. And so they contest this idea that certain groups are more indigenous than others. Well, similarly, we see that argument being made in Asia. But nonetheless, we do see discrete groups, typically numerical minorities, groups that are marginalized again, that maintain different identities within the broader populations of those states in Africa and in Asia that identify indigenous and that do share many of the same problems that we see indigenous peoples experiencing in the Americas. And so that identity as indigenous, I do think in many respects, is apt for particular groups in the African and Asian regions. And increasingly we see even governments in those regions accepting the designation of certain groups as indigenous. So, for example, in the Congo, we see a new law having been passed in recent years addressing specifically indigenous peoples, using the French term population autochtone. Obviously, you see I don't speak French, but something like that, and I'm told it means indigenous peoples. And in the Asian region, increasingly we see governments opening up to addressing particular groups under the rubric of indigenous peoples and applying the international standards that have developed in that regard. We could mention Malaysia in particular, where we see an opening in that regard, Indonesia, and the Philippines as well. So we see an evolution where there's ever more acceptance of the terminology of indigenous peoples, not so much because of some abstract determination that there's some subset of humanity that a priori is indigenous, I think, but more because there's an understanding that there are particular groups that share a certain common set of problems that are appropriately addressed under a common rubric, and the terminology of indigenous peoples is a convenient one to do that.
So in terms of when you have this issue of the framing of indigenous people not being accepted by governments, say, as you were mentioning, in Africa and Asia, what are the bases upon which an outsider can then support their claim as indigenous? Because then it's not just a case of it being self-identifying. There have to be other reasons.
Yeah.
And I was looking at some of the bases for this identification that come up in some of the UN reports. So in the Republic of Congo, one of the ones which is mentioned is that, for example, the Pygmies have a semi-nomadic way of life, or there are examples in the Janajati groups in Nepal that they have this history of subjugation as a particular thing. So these seem to be framing kind of categories that are used beyond self-identification in order to support a claim. Would you say there are ones which come up?
Yeah, well, they do. I mean, one has to look at this more functionally as opposed to in terms of trying to come up with a definition and then seeing if particular groups fit that definition. That's why I've tried to do it. And in my work as Special Rapporteur, especially, I would try to avoid that approach, that definitional approach, and instead go straight to the problem that is being raised, and then see if that problem was appropriate to my mandate as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in doing so, use a human rights framework with understanding that human rights are indeed universal. And it's not the case, in my view, or I think if one accepts the concept of human rights, it's not the case that some groups have more human rights than others. What is the case is some groups have suffered particular kinds of violations in ways that others haven't. And so those groups deserve a particular kind of attention or need of a particular kind of attention or a particular kind of redress for what they've suffered. And so, like I was indicating earlier, indigenous peoples have suffered particular kinds of oppression with a particular kind of common history that exists as among them or between them. And yes, these commonalities include the markers that you indicated of oppression, of marginalization. Not so much being nomadic, because some groups are not nomadic, but the question is, does that characteristic of being nomadic somehow disadvantage them? Yeah. Is that linked to their distinct identity, and are they disadvantaged? And then the question is what to do about that, not so much are they then indigenous. You see, to me, that is, whether or not they're indigenous simply helps us see the relevance of standards and approaches and mechanisms that existed to address these common set of problems. It doesn't define their humanity, it doesn't define their essence, it doesn't define their rights in a fundamental way. What it does is it places these groups within a certain category, a subset of humanity with a certain set of common problems. And so I urge this upon governments when they would resist any kind of inquiry into a group, into a situation on the ground that these groups aren't indigenous. So I would urge them to say, well, let's put that aside for a moment. Let's see what kind of issues they're being faced from a purely human rights perspective, and then see if this categorization of indigenous is useful or not. And if it's not, well, then let's not avoid the human rights problem that we're identifying. Let's proceed anyway to address that. And I actually found that a useful approach, and one that was disarming for some governments, and allowed me, or at least others within the UN human rights system, to engage governments.
Can you give an example of an instance where that was particularly
Well, with India, you mentioned well, perhaps you didn't, perhaps it was a prior interview. I've been talking to a number of people today, but in India, that was a routine response. Okay, these groups are not indigenous. In India, all people who are indigenous are we've suffered our own colonial history that's unique, and I would address that, saying, well, you do identify groups as tribal, and that's kind of close. Yeah. There are certain common characteristics. Your constitution and laws talk about tribal peoples. But then I try to go straight to the issue at hand. So in many of the cases I looked at, there were mega projects, the construction or development of hydroelectric dams within territories of particular groups that were presenting particular problems: resettlement, forced resettlement, disruption of subsistence patterns, for example, access to resources upon which people depended. And so those problems were the ones that I tried to focus attention on, using the human rights framework that I was charged to promote, including the framework as it includes indigenous peoples, to the extent that those norms specific concerning indigenous peoples were relevant.
Could you speak for a moment about the role of religious identity within that? Just because you brought up the example of India. So, for instance, the Naga tribal groups in the northeast of India have in large part converted to Christianity, and that's one of the reasons that the Indian government has tried to deprive them of their scheduled tribe rights. So how do you see the role of indigenous religions and kind of more mainstream religions and instances of conversion changing status? Yeah. How does that play into?
Well, you identify a human rights problem. I'm not sure if it's the categorization of indigenous helps us in this particular case, because typically what we're talking about when we're talking about indigenous peoples are indigenous peoples trying to maintain their own religious traditions, and the claim to do that. What you described are groups that have changed religions, as I understand it, and are insisting on the right to be able to do that. Now, and I think it's best simply to approach it as a human rights issue, as a matter of freedom of religion and non-discrimination. I don't know. I'd have to think about it a little more. I don't know that the indigenous categorization helps us. But by saying that, I'm not saying they have fewer rights than indigenous peoples. To the contrary, I'm saying that they have the same rights. But it's this categorization in the context that you've identified isn't really helpful. So that actually illustrates what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I kind of want to tease out the approach that you take when you want to approach it from a human rights standpoint. You want to say that indigenous people groups are allowed to have and should be given the same rights as other groups, and the reason you have a special emphasis on them is because they haven't been afforded those rights. But how do you bring that to the table if you're dealing, for instance, with a government or an agency which is framing them as particularly indigenous? So, like in the example of India, they are given certain benefits by the government because they have this indigenous identity.
Tribal identity.
Tribal identity, yeah. So how do you then frame it? Because, I mean, if they then just have human rights, in India that means they would lose their benefits if they lose that indigenous identity.
You need to distinguish between human rights, which are universal and based on certain concepts, to particular rights that certain groups might have under domestic legislation. And those may have to do with human rights, but they may have to do with certain arrangements. They may have to do with certain arrangements that might not be very acceptable. I mean, we have in many of these countries laws that the system of apartheid, right, granted different rights to different groups based on their racial status, and assigned them particular territories. And the South African and Namibian governments said that those were, in fact, privileges being provided to these distinct groups, when in fact the rest of the world looked at that system of apartheid as highly discriminatory and damaging to those groups. So there we have an extreme example of domestic legal systems that recognizes distinct rights or status, entitlements to diverse groups. That doesn't have much to do with the international human rights framework, in fact, is in tension with it. And I think that some aspects of India's internal law regarding scheduled tribes can be criticized on that ground as well. I'm not saying it's a system of apartheid, but I am saying that it's not the same as applying the human rights framework to these diverse groups that are identified as scheduled tribes. And so it's really a different kind of situation analysis altogether, I think.
Okay. So would you consider the priority in framing your approach to be largely to do with protecting their autonomy on the particular land or area that they...
Again, the frame of reference are those standards that are developed within this particular category of indigenous peoples that respond to a particular set of problems. And those standards are today most notably articulated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so in my work as Special Rapporteur, and that's what you're asking about, I assume, because I'm also just teach basic human rights and do other things. But I think that's what you're talking about. I would use that as the main frame of reference. And essentially, if an issue didn't fall within what the Declaration speaks to, I would consider it not within my jurisdiction, as you could say. And the Declaration does focus on the collective rights of groups, that collective dimension to the exercise of human rights. For example, language. You can look at language from the individual rights standpoint, but it's not really a complete assessment of that right if you don't take into context the group, because unless you think that talking to yourself is a meaningful exercise of the right to language, and I don't think most people do. So you take into account that group context. Self-governance right. The right of self-governance also includes political participation, but one needs to take into account the fact that indigenous peoples historically continue to have their own institutions of self-governance, and that's so affirming their right, universal human right to political participation and in decision-making that affects them needs to take into account those institutions that are organic to them, and also often require specific arrangements for them because of their difference in order for them to generally participate effectively in the decision-making, governance decision-making that affects them. Then lands and resources, because of the problems that indigenous peoples have faced, the deprivation of their connection with lands and resources, with their traditional lands. The Declaration speaks to that and affirms that indigenous peoples are entitled to maintain those connections to their traditional lands and resources as a matter of their human right to property, as well as their human right to culture, because cultures and their cultural survival is linked to those lands and resources, and often as part of their right to religion, because often in these territories, or characteristically, there's a sacred dimension to places that are important to the survival and existence of distinct groups. And so these are the kinds of issues to which the Declaration the Declaration addresses that, again, relate to these common sets, these common problems that experience, that is in the experience of indigenous peoples, that relates to common histories as well. And not all groups have experienced these. And so while all groups have the same basic human rights, equality, property, political participation, culture, you go down the line of the basic principles, they play themselves out differently with regard to indigenous peoples because of their particular context, their historical context, and the realities today. And the collective dimension of these rights becomes very important, and the remedial aspect of the human rights imperative becomes very important, because it's not simply about sitting back and allowing groups or distinct peoples to exercise rights that they've been exercising all along. It's about addressing those historical deprivations of the rights for these particular groups and the contemporary manifestations of those historical deprivations.
Okay, we'd like to shift the conversation slightly to focus more on environmental and land access issues. Mm-hmm. You briefly touched upon the importance of access to land, especially traditional lands. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering more specifically whether having a certain relationship with the environment factors into the identity for some of the indigenous groups that you've worked with.
Certainly, but I wouldn't overplay that, and you maybe have gotten that from my writing. I think that all of humanity has a relationship with the environment. I think that what we see with indigenous peoples, that knowledge about the relationship with the environment and life, human life, is much more present for a variety of reasons. But I don't think it's necessarily a characteristic unique to indigenous peoples or groups identified as indigenous as opposed to others. It is an important component of indigenous peoples' demands today to have their environments respected, have the natural environment respected, and have their relationship with the natural environment respected in ways that allow them to continue that relationship that they've had with lands and resources.
And so for many indigenous groups, of course, their ways of life and their access to traditional lands have been severely disrupted or harmed by colonialism and other forces. And does the environment or land access play a key role in the goal of achieving reconciliation?
Yes, absolutely. The demand, as I said, of indigenous peoples to their lands relates a good bit to the natural environment and maintaining the natural environment in a state that is such that they were able to continue to benefit from the lands and resources that have sustained them over time, or to regain connections with lands and resources and reestablish those subsistence patterns that historically have sustained them. But it's also about maintaining or reacquiring a cultural space. The land base is that spatial element of culture for indigenous peoples. It's what allows them to exercise the various dimensions of their lives that constitute them as a distinct culture. So that land base, having that land base is important for that. And yes, very often the environmental aspect is very much important to that as well. But then it's not necessarily the case that indigenous peoples aspire to maintain the natural environment in a pristine state. Indigenous peoples, like others, strive very often to benefit from the resources materially in a way that's consistent with maintaining the resources as a land base that's essential to the continuation of their cultures. And so increasingly we even see the development initiatives by indigenous peoples themselves. Once they're able to secure control over lands and resources, we see development initiatives by them running in to loggerheads or tensions with, or resulting in tensions with environmental groups, those who would want to maintain the land area pristine. Or we see initiatives, say, by major conservation organizations, world conservation organizations, or conservation organizations that operate on a global level, and governments to establish protected areas, national parks, these kinds of things. We see those initiatives creating tensions with indigenous peoples. Often these organizations are very surprised. Oh, why they don't want us to establish this pristine national park where they live so that they can continue to live like they always have. They're very surprised when the indigenous people say, well, you didn't talk to us about that. Now you're limiting our ability to develop the way we want to on these resources that are ours. And but these organizations are learning, I think, and these initiatives are becoming more sensitive to indigenous people's own aspirations for development. But it is something that we're seeing more and more of as indigenous peoples more and more claim a voice in decision making that affects them. We're seeing more and more of these tensions arise where environmental groups or conservation groups want to set up a conservation area, or national park, something like that, and indigenous peoples resist that, or at least question it, those initiatives, because they're not adequately part of those initiatives.
Have tensions between indigenous groups and environmentalists, perhaps because of a divergence of interests, factored into your work at all, or do you have any?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I looked at a number, when I was Special Rapporteur, I looked at a number of these cases where we saw national parks being set up, particularly in Africa, where the indigenous groups or groups, whatever you want to call them, that are isolated and live in areas where these protected zones are being established, or these national parks are being established, haven't historically had a voice, and so we now that more and more attention is being given to their particular interests and concerns, and they're acquiring more of a voice in the national arena and even the international arena. You're seeing more and more that they're expressing concern and opposition to the creation of these conservation areas in their traditional territories, unless they're part of the process for creating them, unless they are actual beneficiaries in a real sense from what these protected areas may bring. and unless their own aspirations for development are accommodated in the establishment of these areas. It's not that indigenous people's interests are at odds necessarily. Not certainly, it's not the case that they're always at odds with conservation initiatives. I think that for the most part they are, but it's the lack of participation in the establishment of these protected areas and these conservation zones that raises a concern, and that indigenous peoples then question, or the basis for their questioning of these initiatives.
Do you think so it sounds like environmentalists maybe are coming to more of an understanding that indigenous groups do, have motivations when it comes to conservation areas, and they don't simply share the interests of environmentalists. And do you think this sort of has arisen or can be furthered through more of individual advocacy or kind of through legal mechanisms? What's a way to improve this relationship or improve environmentalists' knowledge and awareness of?
I think environmentalists are becoming more sensitive to indigenous people's distinct interests. But I think really the ultimate solution is for there to be an awareness by environmental groups that they really have distinct interests, not necessarily opposing interests, but they're distinct, and they need to just step aside, in my view, from indigenous people's own sphere of activism and their own articulation of their aspirations and demands. We see too much of a forced alliance by environmental groups with indigenous peoples, particularly in the developing world, where indigenous peoples don't have their own independent financial means for advocacy, or they don't have other allies. And so at particular points in a controversy over resources, for example, there might be a very natural and strategic alliance forged between environmental groups and indigenous people, say opposing an oil development project that is causing devastation in an indigenous territory. It's of course in the interest of indigenous peoples to stop that, because it's polluting the waters and the soils and the natural habitat that they live from or want to live from. And environmentalists are, of course, they exist to oppose such polluting or devastating development projects that we see all too often, or have seen all too often in various parts of the world that are a result of oil and gas development. But then at the time when, say we're at a place where there are new possibilities for development that aren't as polluting or of the same character as what indigenous peoples have experienced before, and indigenous peoples may want to entertain some development in their territories, including oil development. Environmentalist groups can be very much in the way of indigenous peoples exploring and pursuing the options that they certainly are entitled to explore and pursue as a matter of their own self-determination. I like to say that indigenous peoples, just like anybody else, can have the right to make mistakes, have the right to choose their own path for development that may, in fact, be paths that aren't entirely in sync with other people's conception of what is correct. But unless they have that right, they really don't have the right to self-determination. They simply have the right to make choices that those from the outside, particularly environmentalist groups, think are correct.
So it seems that we have these two categories that we're using here of things being sacred and protected in terms of this dialogue that's going on between environmentalist groups and indigenous peoples. I was wondering if you could speak to that relationship between the sacred and the land from an indigenous people's perspective when they're stating their right to the land. Is it the case that the land itself is viewed as sacred, and how does that tie into the practices being carried out on the land are sacred, and the relationship? Because it seems that a lot of the partnership confusion that happens with environmentalist groups is that they assume that indigenous people groups will see the land the same way they do, that it should be left to a greater degree as possible in the condition that it was found. Right. And so in order for that not to be the way that indigenous people groups think, there must be another understanding of what it means for that land to be sacred to them. And I was wondering if you could...
Well, you can't, it's impossible to generalize.
Yeah.
And it's, on the one hand, it's different for different groups, this notion of what is sacred and how that relates to the land. And then within the same groups, you have certain areas that may be sacred and others that aren't. Or maybe the whole area may be considered at some level sacred, but that doesn't mean it can't be developed. You know, the mountain could be sacred, but so could the minerals within it, as used in a particular way. And so the sacred mountain gives the minerals for the minerals to be used in a sacred way. I'm not revealing any particular attribute of any particular group, but I'm just giving an example, a hypothetical one, really, because it is a complex matter. And I just think it's important to understand that something being sacred doesn't necessarily mean it cannot be used. Yeah. In fact, its sacred quality could come from its utility in many ways, like the animal lives. You know, in many cultures, animals are hunted, they're killed, and that is a sacred act. Yeah. Whereas for the environmentalist vegetarian, that's like really terrible. You know, and it's often hard to understand how that can be a sound way of going about life, killing an animal and then eating it, and much less to understand how that could be sacred. So, you know, it's a complex matter. One cannot generalize about these things.
Do you think there's a point then at which that runs out? Is there a point at which, one of the discussions we were having in this class when we were talking about this issue was whether there can be a point at which a government or outside agency can say the way that this indigenous people group have used this land is not appropriate. Is there a point in which the utility runs out? I know that that's very tied into previous problems of colonialism and oppression. But yeah, there's this question of at what point is that right to the land exhausted, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're mostly, in most contexts, we're not there because indigenous peoples don't have secure rights to begin with. So that would be a good problem to have, I think, where you have indigenous peoples really in control of their lands, saying, well, we're going to put a coal plant here because we want to, and then the state regulator coming and say, oh, wait a minute, we have to regulate that. I think that's a good problem to have when we're having that debate where indigenous peoples are in control of the development of the resources and at a place where the outside world is saying, wait a minute, we have an interest too, because what you're doing is having externalities that generates a concern on our part. We need to then come to terms on what you're doing and how it affects our lives. I happen to think that there is a space for that dialogue. I mean, you have certain people who take the view of absolute indigenous sovereignty. You know, I don't think there is any absolute sovereignty on the part of any segment of humanity, on the part of governments or states themselves, independent states. I think we're in a world where we all have to live together somehow. And I think that if indigenous peoples have had a say in the construction of the governance institutions around them, and that there's some kind of agreement or acquiescence that they by which we can say that they are genuinely part of the broader governance institutions, including those of the state itself, then the state does have a legitimate interest and claim to regulating, to some extent, what happens within indigenous territories, to the extent what happens there affects some elsewhere. This is not an entirely academic debate. You have, for example, tribes in the western United States at times wanting to store radioactive waste. And clearly there's a concern on the part of surrounding communities about that, and I think rightly so. And the national government, in this case the federal government, has an interest in regulating that, and the tribes have an interest in coming to terms with the broader society through the federal government about that as well.
It seems that establishing property rights may be an effective tool for enforcing the rights of Indigenous people to land and resources through land titling, for example. And I was wondering whether you perceive there to be any disadvantages, culturally or otherwise, to setting up those types of property structures.
Ideally, there'd be this respect for Indigenous people's customary land tenure patterns without having to have those land tenure patterns specifically identified and registered. But that isn't practical in today's world, or practicable in today's world, given the competition over lands and resources. There needs to be some kind of identification of who owns, in a sense, what, and where one's rights to extend, and what the character of those rights is. And it's the registration or titling process, or in many countries the demarcation process by which that is achieved. And so I think, on balance, these mechanisms for specifically identifying Indigenous people's lands and the types of rights they have within those territories, or the rights they have beyond those areas where they have exclusive ownership or something like exclusive ownership, that's necessary on balance. And we're seeing thus a number of initiatives across the world to do just that, to title lands or to demarcate them and secure them in favor of Indigenous peoples. Now, the disadvantage is that it tends to freeze in time processes that may not have been frozen or in time, or that aren't frozen. That is where Indigenous peoples have migrated over time, or their land use areas have expanded or contracted, or have developed in certain ways over time to use certain kinds of resources. And those are natural patterns, but it's difficult to sustain those when you have competition over areas, and particularly difficult when that competition results in degradation of the resources. And so there's a need to have some overarching regulatory framework that tries to ensure against the degradation of the resources for the benefit of everybody, while securing the rights for all, the legitimate rights of all concerned, including Indigenous peoples.
So, sort of going broader to your career with the United Nations, we know that you are the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a drafter of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I was wondering what you perceive to be the most effective tools the United Nations has in order to assert the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Of the many
well,
tools.
First of all, you sort of aggrandized my contributions. I really didn't have a career. I had an appointment for 6 years, and it should be understood this position of Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one that is outside of the bureaucracy of the UN. It's a sort of sui generis status. The UN is made up of member states, of course, and they're represented by diplomats in the various functional bodies of the United Nations, such as the Commission, or excuse me, the Human Rights Council, which used to be the Commission on Human Rights. Now it's the Human Rights Council, is made up of governments. And then you have the bureaucracy, which is that permanent staff that services the initiatives of the United Nations that are set in motion by the member states. And then you have these so-called independent experts that are appointed by the governments, in this case, in my case, by the Human Rights Council, to work in certain areas. But we're appointed to be independent from everybody, including the bureaucracy. So even though the bureaucracy assists these independent experts, so I had people within the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights helping me, and even though I was appointed by the governments, the Human Rights Council, I presumably, and I think I did, was to operate on an independent basis, not taking instructions from the government or from the bureaucracy, and to give an independent assessment of what I saw. And so I just wanted to clarify that what position I had within the United Nations. It wasn't a staff position or a career position by any means. It was a limited appointment for 2 consecutive terms. And that did give me a perspective on the question that you raised, though. What can the UN do? And I came out of it thinking not much, honestly. And what it could do, it isn't doing enough of, or what it is good at, I should say, it's not doing enough of. I think what the UN can really contribute in this area, that is promoting the rights of indigenous peoples, and what it's not doing enough of is awareness raising about, one, the problems that indigenous peoples face on a global level. What we see is this sort of international elite that includes certain government representatives, independent experts that are connected with the UN system, non-government organizations, and a cadre of indigenous representatives that go to international meetings that are aware of indigenous issues. But that hasn't penetrated into the system as such, that is the UN system, and on an operational level, very broadly anyway. In my dealings around the world with different countries, in different countries I should say, I would also deal with not just government representatives of those countries, but also with United Nations representatives in those countries. The UN has a presence in a lot of developing countries, if not most. And I would often, in most cases that I would visit, when I visited a country, I'd deal with them. And I was astounded to see the lack of awareness of the UN operatives in those countries about the presence of indigenous peoples, the issues they faced, or the standards that were to be applied or promoted. So it's even within the UN system, there is insufficient awareness. Within government bureaucracies, there is insufficient awareness. Beyond those diplomats who go to the UN meetings that concern indigenous peoples, they're very well versed in the international standards, the UN Declaration, the issues, they know what to say. But at the country level, at the operational level, the awareness of indigenous issues, the standards that apply to them, is extremely thin to non-existent. Not to mention the societal level. I'm quite sure that most people living in New Haven don't know anything about the Native people that historically lived in this area, or that still do. The issues that they faced, how it is that they came to not be around as much as they used to be, and what the result of that displacement has been. The same for where I live, in the southwest of the United States. You know, we're surrounded, Tucson, Arizona is surrounded by living indigenous communities, yet the majority of the population is completely oblivious to their presence and what that means. And so awareness raising within society as well. So at all within the UN system, within government, and within societies, there needs to be greater awareness, and with that education about what the challenges are that indigenous peoples face and the kind of initiatives that need to be put in place. And with that awareness, there's greater sensitivity. The political class responds more, which is extremely important. And these issues then not only can be addressed, but can be many of the problems that arise can be avoided entirely. And the UN has your question of what can the UN do, it can contribute to that process much better than it does now. What does it do? Instead, it appoints one special rapporteur to cover the whole world, to go around looking at problems and reporting back. And it establishes a permanent forum on indigenous issues. It gives them 2 weeks for everybody to come together and talk about whatever they want to on indigenous issues. And everybody some media goes, it's not the mainstream media, goes and like to take pictures of the indigenous people in their traditional dress, and it's all colorful, and everybody comes fuzzy-hearted and feeling good about it. The people are there, but then across the street in Manhattan, no one's really aware of what's happening across the street at the end. No one really cares, what's happening. They care to the extent that they might find some pleasure in seeing indigenous people walk around the streets of Midtown in the traditional dress, but it's very much something that doesn't penetrate into the broader society. That presence of indigenous peoples at the United Nations in New York once a year, and so a lot of energy is being devoted to sort of rehashing what's already been talked about within the UN system, and not enough energy to targeted initiatives to raising awareness and expanding education and problem solving on the ground. And I think the UN system could contribute a lot more in that way.
It seems that you're raising this question essentially of reconciliation between indigenous peoples and those who are non-indigenous peoples in the same area, how you bring them into conversation. In terms of awareness raising, how do you go about that without just creating a different form of distance, where you have the kind of awareness raising like when children in school learn about indigenous people groups, but it's a different group of people that are not like them, who live in a reservation, they have their own, and there is an actual communication between the two groups. That doesn't seem like societal reconciliation to me. It seems like further education, normally about history rather than current events. How do you go about awareness that leads to reconciliation? Right.
Well, you stated the problem, right? I understand you to be not saying what should be happening, but what might already be happening and what contributes to the problem. This distancing of indigenous people, because to the extent they are taught about in schools, it's about something in the past, it's something about the they, as opposed to part of the we, and that contributes to this lack of societal awareness about indigenous peoples and their issues today, by reinforcing that notion that they are distant and something of the past. And typically with that distance and historical perspective, there's a denigration of indigenous peoples. They're viewed as something that was in the way of development, something maybe at best curious, the noble savage, but some noble savage destined to pass away because of the inability to survive in the modern world. I mean, that's the attitude that we see prevailing within the educational system, to the extent that indigenous peoples, at least in this country, are treated within the educational system. How to get away with that, how to get around that, I'm actually not entirely sure how to do that. I just know that's not the way to do it. If I just think of my own area, the area of law and legal education, I can think of various ways in which we could incorporate within the curriculum of legal education awareness of indigenous peoples, and not just the problems that were imposed upon them, but also the contributions that they made. We have we teach property, for example, in law schools, and issues having to do with the original inhabitants are very much, or should be very much, part of our instruction about property. How did this property system develop around indigenous territories to begin with? I think in most property law books there's one case, and basically says, well, they were conquered, and that's it. And that's it. There's nothing more than that, when in fact it's much more complex than that. And and what about all this territory that today is under indigenous control? How does that figure within our property system, within our study of federal public lands and public lands more generally, natural resources more generally? These issues can be incorporated. Constitutional law is rich in issues having to do with indigenous peoples, which typically aren't treated within your typical constitutional law class. In my own work on international law and international human rights, I've incorporated issues concerning indigenous peoples, but not just say, okay, today we're going to study indigenous peoples, and then tomorrow we're going to move on to something else, but rather to incorporate these very cross-cutting issues that we've been talking about today throughout the course, issues of collective rights, equity, what does equality mean in different contexts, reconciliation, reparations. I mean, all these issues can be looked at with attention to the contributions that indigenous peoples have made. And so we could do that at all levels of education in one way or another, from primary education to secondary education, university education. And if we talk about policy making on the part of on the part of governments, certainly there's something to be said for including indigenous voices within that policy making, much more so than is done today. What I found when I would engage governments was that I would ask about indigenous issues, for example, with the health departments or health ministries, and they say, "Oh, well, that's the indigenous department over there." I said, "What do you mean? You know, what about how do you treat the particular problems that indigenous communities face, or do you incorporate traditional practices, healing practices, in your outreach for in developing and promoting health programs?" These kind of issues I try to raise with the mainstream ministries, and that, I think, is where we start to get more awareness raising, the kind of education that's needed, and then ultimately the implementation of these standards that in principle have been agreed upon by this sort of club that I mentioned earlier, the regulars, the usual suspects among government actors, non-government actors, and UN bureaucrats that are in this world of indigenous rights. And we all know each other. It's like, I mean, you could put us all in one room, really. Not much bigger than this. I mean, yeah, somewhat bigger than this. I mean, it's like you know who the government representative is going to be. You go to a meeting across the globe, it's the same government representative, and they say the same thing, which is completely at odds with what they're doing. Government, see the same NGOs, you know, just showing up saying the same thing, and the same so-called experts saying the same thing. And if today I'm the special rapporteur, tomorrow I'm a professor from someplace saying the same thing. You know, showing up, being invited to the same meeting to say the same thing. And it's just a very kind of insular group that isn't penetrating much, but it makes a lot of noise. And so then you have a class at Yale talking about this stuff, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have time for one more question. So in terms of that last question, in this classroom you have law students and divinity students and forestry school students. How would you like to see this group of, in some way, this kind of strange Ivy League small group, how can we be part of infiltrating that gap between knowledge and awareness and reconciliation?
Oh, that is a big question. Well, I would turn the question around. Given what we've talked about, how could each of you see yourself? I don't want to use the word contribute. At least being a participant in some way, in moving forward and seeing human rights enjoyed more universally and enjoyed by groups that have suffered particular disadvantage. I think that's something we each need to ask ourselves and see how we can do that in whatever specific role we take on in our professional lives or lives as students or otherwise. It's not a matter of saying, okay, I'm today going to become an indigenous advocate, and I'm going to go out there like a missionary and start doing that, devote my life to it, I have the calling, and so I'm going. It's about that awareness that I think I've stressed, taking that on, being sensitive to it, and whatever you do, apply that sensitivity in a constructive way.
Great, thank you very much.